Hello, everybody. I'm John Haig. I am the co-director of the Mosava Rahmani Center for Business and Government. And we are extremely fortunate today. We have a large cast in front of us, which makes for a really interesting discussion. The topic, climate populism, the anti-elite backlash against the green transition. And I guess I'll start at that end a little bit. Robert Lawrence, who some of you have probably had as a professor. He is the Albert L. Williams Professor of International Trade and Investment. He's also a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and faculty chair of the practice of trade policy here at the Kennedy School. But like many good faculty members at the Kennedy School, he also has some practical experience. He was on the Council of Economic Advisors from 1998 to 2000. He's also been a senior fellow at Brookings, written multiple books and multiple articles, which I will figure much of that will come up in the course of the discussion today. I'll leave it to that. I'm going to jump to this end to Dustin Tingley. And Dustin is a professor of government in the government department here at Harvard. He's also a deputy, I think I got it right, deputy vice provost for advances in learning. So he gets the chance to see all the exciting things going on at Harvard at the moment. His research is on international relations, international political economy, climate change, causal inference, data science, machine learning, and digital education. And I can say that almost in one sentence, but it's a lot. He had a new book, Uncertain Futures, How to Unlock the Climate Impasse. He chairs Harvard's Standing Committee on Climate Education, and he co-authored the university-wide report entitled The Future of Climate Education at Harvard. So breadth of perspective on this topic. Elaine Buckberg PhD is a senior fellow at the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability here at Harvard. She was the chief economist for General Motors from 2018 to 2023. And when she was there, it was assessing the impact of worldwide economic developments on the corporation and for providing advice on various competitive and economic policy issues. So, and does a lot of work here, working on long-term forecasting and looking at the electric vehicle market, and hopefully that will continue for a while. So we'll leave it at that. And then the last is Edo Campanella. And Edo is a senior fellow, research fellow here at the Mosava Rahmani Center for Business and Government. He is also the senior global economist at Unicredit Bank. And he writes a number of articles he and I have published together on occasion. He writes a globally syndicated column for Project Syndicate. He's written in foreign affairs, foreign policy. He is also a David Rockefeller Fellow of the Trilateral Commission and has previously worked at the Economic Research Department of the World Trade Organization, World Economic Forum, and perhaps surprisingly, interestingly to me, the Italian Senate. So I'm not sure how that happened, but so with that, Edo is going to help moderate the panel. With that, I will turn it over to them. It's all yours. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming. Food is always an attraction, I realize, for students. And thanks for our panelists for coming.
So, John, thanks a lot for the introduction and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this panel on climate populism that is likely to gather momentum in the coming months, especially ahead of the European election in June and the presidential election here in the US in the fall. We saw farmers blocking the streets of several European capitals for several weeks recently. They were protesting against strict environmental rules. Ursula von der Leyen, if she gets re-elected as president of the European Commission, will likely water down her signature Green New Deal. Donald Trump, if re-elected, will probably withdraw again the US from the Paris Climate Agreement. So the purpose of our panel today is to understand the causes of this phenomenon and also potential remedies. The structure of the panel is the usual. We will talk, the four of us, for around 40 minutes, then we will open up the floor for debate with the audience. I ask the speakers to be well behaved in the sense that we are four and we don't have much time. So if you can compress your answer in 4 or 5 minutes, it would be appreciated. So I would like to start from Robert. In full disclosure, Robert and I have been working on this topic for quite some time. We have a paper coming out soon, hopefully. And I would like him to give us some context about this phenomenon. And in particular, I would like you, Roberts, to explain why we believe that the new populist wave that is centered around this backlash against the green transition is in the making, especially on the rise, on the right, and how it differs from the previous populist wave we experienced in 2016.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be on this panel and to be working with Edo on this question. I come to this question somewhat bruised and battered because I'm a trade economist. And for a long time, we just assumed the world was smoothly transitioning to greater and deeper integration. And then somewhere around 2015, the world suddenly changed on us. And we discovered that there were these populist movements signified by Brexit on the one hand, and by Donald Trump's election, just the most vivid demonstration of these undercurrents, which had been there for quite a while, but suddenly came to fruition. And then when we look more broadly, they were quite pervasive in many, many different countries around the world. The trade community was totally ill-equipped to deal with this. And in effect, what we've seen over the subsequent decade is that trade policies have been completely changed, and we've moved in a much more protectionist direction. And in a sense, it looked like that was enough, and it would quiet down these populist forces. But in recent times, I and Edo and all of you probably have become aware that as we've implemented climate change policies, we've seen similar examples of a growing backlash to the imposition of these policies. And as if you think about it, climate change policies are ideally suited for a populist response. Populism is a complex phenomenon, but a key feature of populism is the division of society between the elite and the people. And you put those who, the populists put those who they like as the people, they put those who they dislike as the elite. And in the case of it's interesting, in the case of the left, the elite would be categorized as the corporations, and they're seen as sluggish, if you will, and continuing to promote fossil fuels and getting rich off those fossil fuels and resistance to climate change policies, whereas the ordinary people are going to be damaged. And so on the left, actually, the tendency is for those who are populist to be quite in favor of climate change policies. But on the right, the opposite is true. There, the elite are these scientists and other people who are trying to change our way of life. And they're doing so in a way where when we try to engage them, I'm just putting myself as a typical populist, they tell us, well, it's the science. We have to listen to the science to change what we're doing. And this is the ideal enemy. And the way in which we should adapt is through global agreements, global institutions, which, again, exacerbate their nationalist feelings. So they've been asked to change their way of life. In Europe, what's happening is it's coming through taxation, higher costs of carbon. And in the United States, it's come through the IRA. And the IRA has a lot of bells and whistles. And a lot of those bells and whistles really subsidies for the use of union workers, extra subsidies for energy communities and depressed areas. Many of them trigger antagonisms to, and in a sense, have led on the right to growing antagonism to climate change policies, because they're seen as a sort of a left-wing expression. So the policies are feeding into an already existing polarization, which exists in the United States, where one's views aren't necessarily independently formed, but are rather part of one's identity. And in a sense, the identity that's on the Republican side is to be antagonistic towards climate change policies. And indeed, we saw Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, his first bill before Congress was basically, and he got it passed, was basically an attack on the IRA. So in the United States, when we talk about populists, we're actually talking about a core group, a very important part of our political system, and they're actively engaged in opposition. In Europe, as Edo has described, where the policies have been stronger, prices are rising. When we look at studies on what they're going to do, they are going to create a lot of losers. Climate change requires a painful adaptation of the economy. The broad middle class will be affected through more expensive use of energy. And then the particular energy communities are going to be radically transformed. And although the Europeans have been more generous, and I guess we'll get to policy later in this discussion, my judgment would be that they're not adequate, basically, to deal with the dislocation. And I think in the United States, even in the IRA, where we've looked at it quite closely, the American approach is not sufficiently driven by the needs of the particular communities. The basic assumption has been that we'll get the people who are working in brown jobs to get green jobs and to train them to do so. So I don't think that they're meeting the needs of those communities either. So I think a combination of broad political trends and specific difficulties associated with dislocation are going to make this a growing political, an issue of growing political concern.
Thanks, Robert. We will definitely dig deeper into these industrial policies, both in the US and in Europe, in a moment. I would like to stick more to the political dimension of the problem. Dustin, as John said, has recently written a beautiful book called Uncertain Futures, was also kind enough to bring some copies that will be raffled off at the end of the panel. And I would, in the book, you make an interesting argument. You say that resistance to climate policies is due to the fact that measures that are supposed to support local communities in navigating this transition lack credibility. What do you mean by this credibility challenge?
Sure. Well, it's good to see everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be on a panel with esteemed peers. So let me just start my remarks similar to how Robert led off, which was he led off that he was a trade economist. The first part of my career, I was a trade political scientist. which basically what that meant was I was only concerned about the winners and losers. That's what we cared about, right? I mean, that was the meat of the politics around trade. And, in places like the United States, we had this notion of like, we could have these institutions that would somehow compensate the losers, help them transition. So we had things like trade adjustment assistance. And, looking back, some of my earliest work in this area was actually doing public opinion polling on something I called climate adjustment assistance, which was nominally designed to say, hey, like if we're going to need to transition these either fossil fuel producing regions or places in highly intense areas of use of fossil fuels, we've got to figure something out because that's not going to be an overnight transition. Just as the sort of deindustrialization of the United States manufacturing faced a big hit as we liberalized trade. And the reality with trade adjustment assistance was there was both not much of it ever available. It would occasionally become the target of different political axes. And the design of it was oftentimes very skewed towards thinking about things in terms of individual workers rather than broader communities, right? And so as a result, most people think that things like trade adjustment assistance really were not all that effective, even though in principle, if you look at the sort of economist idea of like trade liberalization, we'd have enough kind of resources to spread out and help that transition. But by and large, it was a failure. And so the concern that we raise in our book around credibility is the following idea. All right, we're making some promises now. All right, we've got some nice bells and whistles in the IRA. We're going to help these communities. A lot of my book was based upon field work in places like Appalachia. So we're gonna dangle these things out. Well, these communities have had programs like this put on their doorstep in the past, only to have had them removed several years later. And here's the rub. This is a decades-long transition. This is not one of these like, all right, we're gonna invest in this community, we're gonna drive maybe a little manufacturing in, everything's good, all the talent stays, so on and so forth. Well, this is gonna be decades in the making. Furthermore, we're gonna need some of those fossil fuels in the meantime. I think this is like a sort of a misunderstanding of how this transition is gonna work. We're gonna need them to be, some of these areas to be productive, especially things like natural gas. Otherwise, the lights are gonna go off in many parts of our country. So we're making these promises of a transition, but these communities know that those promises fundamentally aren't credible because in the future, other political parties could be in power that would have different policies in place, or even the priorities of a particular administration, they can change over time, right? And we've seen this countless times in all sorts of other policy areas. And it's really hard for governments to tie their hands, right? In the future, because when the future arrives, they might have different incentives to do different things. And that's the fundamental idea of credibility. Those of you who've ever taken an economics class, this is a credible commitment problem or the time inconsistency problem. It turns out this way of thinking, which is not how we entered this project, is squarely on the minds of these communities. They would literally sort of tell us these textbook accounts of credible commitment problems, which I always thought were these like nerdy things that economists and political scientists came up with. And they would just tell us these dynamics using different language, of course, oftentimes the language of things like trust or, nobody ever listens to me, what we want, these sort of things come up. And so this is squarely on the mind of these folks. And so when they're thinking about this, they're like, well, geez, this transition doesn't sound so good to me, doesn't sound so good to us. And so, what do you see happen? I mean, West Virginia used to be one of the most sought, my dad's family is from West Virginia, used to be one of the most solid Democratic Party states in the country. And now it's nothing but a Republican stronghold, right? And so, you get these political electoral changes as people apprise, well, what are the costs and benefits of these policies? And if there are programs that are designed to minimize the costs for me, are they going to be long lasting? Are they going to be enough? That's another question, right? And quite frankly, what's on the other side for me? Some types of green jobs simply don't pay as much as others. Elaine, who's an expert in EVs, I think, has some really interesting things to say about EVs, but that's not necessarily the case for all sectors. The joke we are oftentimes told is, what's maintenance on a solar field? Maintenance on a solar field is a weed whacker and Windex. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? But that's and these are prevailing views, right? I mean, we can try to adjust and say, no, that's actually wrong in this or that way. We are often told precisely it's the fact that coal-fired power plants are so dirty that they employ a bunch of people because you need a lot of maintenance, right? And so unions would then say, hey, like, these are good jobs, they're long lasting, they're durable, they pay well, and so on and so forth. So, I think there's a lot to like in what some of the Biden administration has done with the IRA, but Robert's point is squarely right. Are these the types of investments in industries that these communities think they'll be able to thrive with or not? That's another big question. And finally, I would say, just because Robert mentioned the sort of broader context, places like Germany are going through the exact same thing, except they've had more money on offer. Now, there's lots of calls to start to claw back some of the allocated money. So, like, again, whether that money is going to stick around, that's, again, illustrating the credibility problem. But also, there's substantial heterogeneity within Germany on how this is going. It's gone pretty well in Western Germany. It's a total disaster in Eastern Germany. Oh, and guess where the rise of far-right parties have squarely been? It's in Eastern Germany. And so, like in the United States, the sort of politics of this are very interesting because some of them become hyper-regionalized, right, for a variety of reasons. And some topics, not all, but on some topics. And so this is not just a concern that's happening in the United States. Finally, I would say, I'm talking now about relatively rich industrialized economies. When we start to talk about these same issues in the developing world, think Indonesia, one of the largest exporters of coal, think South Africa and the Mpumalanga region, the budgets simply aren't available to even try at these sort of compensatory regimes. And furthermore, rich industrialized countries aren't keeping up with our commitments for things around climate finance to provide transfers internationally. So there's a credibility problem even at the level of transfers between international rich countries and poorer developing countries. And the hopes that they're going to be able to transition some of their regions that are employed in these industries is even weaker, right? So we're in a best case situation in the United States, areas of Europe. All of these dynamics are going to be even harder in the developing country context.
Thanks a lot, Dustin. And talking about the credibility issue, I think, and shifting more to the economic policy dimension of the problem, when people talk about green industrial policy, especially the promoter of these policies, they tend to emphasize that in the end, we will end up having more jobs than we destroy. So green jobs will outnumber the brown jobs that are going to be killed by these policies. If we look at the debate, the academic debate, there isn't really a consensus on whether these industrial policies will create more jobs than they kill. In the paper, Robert and I, we discuss electric vehicles. I know you completely disagree with what we write, and so it's good if you bring it up, right now.
Make it spicy.
But basically, the argument we make is that to produce electric vehicles, you need fewer parts because the engine is of the traditional cars is more complex, and this means that we will end up having fewer jobs. So can you comment on this, but also specifically, but also more broadly, your view also coming from a corporate, from the private sector, your general view on the employment power of these industrial policies?
Thanks, Edo, and thanks for inviting me to be here today. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. So let's focus on autos and the labor needs of making EVs versus internal combustion engine vehicles or gas-powered vehicles. And I think the concerns about job losses are overblown. So first of all, let's start with most of the cars same. It has seats, it has doors, it has wheels, so on. So the difference is about the propulsion system or what makes it move forward. And I think there's this comparison of parts is a myth, because what's actually and going from number of parts to hours is just inaccurate in terms of what actually the labor demands. And different kinds of production processes have different needs and different complexity. So overall, an EV takes about the same amount of labor to make as an ICE or a gas-powered vehicle. But we got to start from the background at first. How did this arise? It's not just that math. It's no one likes change. Change is scary. So the first reaction, of course, is fear and skepticism. And the second is like, what are the details? So we can think about three categories of jobs. So first of all, let's talk about those propulsion systems. So in a gas-powered vehicle, you have an engine, a transmission, and a gas tank, more or less. And in an EV, you've got battery. That's the cells. First you make cells, and then you make a pack. And then you've got electric motors or drive units. You have one or two of those. And then you've got cooling systems and a whole bunch of extra wiring and electronics. And so it's different jobs, but bottom line is my understanding, it's about the same number of jobs. Now, and pay attention, the UAW fought for and won in the last contract that all the battery plants for GM, Ford, and Stellantis are automatically unionized by UAW under the main contract. So it's a couple of different wins. One, UAW doesn't have to go and unionize or attempt to unionize each one. So not only could they not go union, they could go with a different union. And two, there are multiple different contracts with these automakers, between the automakers and the UAW, and you got them under the richest one. So that means that their volume of the UAW's numbers will be higher going forward. But that also tells you that their big concern was not necessarily that there are fewer jobs, but I want those battery jobs, so that I don't have fewer jobs when that engine plant is no longer, or there aren't as many engine plants, but there are all these battery plants. And indeed, you've got the background of the IRA, which does create a lot of incentive to put jobs, especially battery manufacturing jobs in the US. So then we've got one more category, and that's final assembly. And so that's putting together the vehicles from generally large components that have been made in other plants or by suppliers. And again, assembly is somewhat different, but there's no real net change. And again, it's not just the battery and the drive units, there's the cooling systems, there's additional electric monitoring. And then just as a baseline, there's a general trend towards more content in vehicles. You no longer have a dashboard in a new vehicle of mechanical dials. You've got a screen with all sorts of electronic systems that sensor, they tell you if your tire needs to be filled. And then there's increasing amounts of safety technology that has all sorts of sensors and cameras. So there's a systemic trend towards more content. There's one area where there's a difference, and that's repair and maintenance. So if you have an internal combustion engine car, you have to service it every 6 months, or you should, and get an oil change every 3 months or 3,000 miles. With an EV, there's a lot less service. So for example, one of our two EVs is a Chevy Bolt EV, and that requires the first maintenance at 7,500 miles to rotate tires. That's sort of the most common thing you do on an EV. And then the first actual service at 15,000 miles. For the average driver, that's about a year and 3 months. So last, bringing back to this political alignment and populism, the US unions have traditionally been aligned with the Democrats, and that's not been as tight in the last few years. And I think that that's a potential source of climate populism on the left.
Thanks. And maybe, Robert, we can go back to you. I don't know if you want to react to any of these, but starting to think about remedies, you wrote extensively about these green industrial policies, both in the US and in Europe. In your opinion, what's missing in this legislation to make the green transition more acceptable for citizens?
Okay. While I'm impressed by the analysis that we've heard on the autos, just let me deal with it just briefly. The problem is, to me, the relevant issue is not necessarily the total number of jobs, but will there be a significant amount of dislocation in the process? Because what we've seen, for instance, is that if the skills requirements are different, if in particular the location of those factories are different, you're nonetheless going to have significant adjustments. In particular, we have been using, and maybe the economists that I've read are wrong, but they've been looking at, in a sense, the parts industry. And there are certain parts that are simply obsolete. So the drivetrains, in a sense, and transmission are no longer present in the electric vehicle. So if you were building gears, if you will, and transmission systems, your plant is going to close down. And then we're also not necessarily going to see the firms themselves command the same shares in the market. When we get down to it, you know, and particularly, much is going to depend on our trade policies, how open our economy is going to be. If we were actually to put a priority on climate change, we would open the US market because Chinese electric vehicles are they are currently taking over global markets in EVs. And if we let them and the Europeans let them, we're due for the next installment of the China shock. So there could be significant dislocation as a result. If you turn to, your question about...
Just 1 second. Do you, Elaine, want to react to these?
I would love to, if that's okay.
Yeah,
great.
You should.
So I think that the concern about place and is absolutely relevant, that there can be places where there are engine plants that may not be the location of a future battery or battery pack plant. And batteries are really heavy. Battery packs are extremely heavy. So you're much more interested in co-locating, especially that battery pack assembly, really close to your vehicle assembly plant, because the transportation is more challenging and more expensive than it would be with an engine. On obsolescence, it's gradual over time. So reasonable forecasts and the Biden administration target is that 50% of sales are EV by 2030. And then generally you're making parts for another 15 years. So you're gradually trending down. And the IRA does include some supplier transitioning. But I think a really important thing is I think automakers are really going to want to bring their workers along. And there is, in manufacturing, I think there's a lot of very relevant concern about the manufacturing workforce of the future. That there's this political myth that everyone wants to work in manufacturing. It's the great job that doesn't require a college education. And at the highest wages, I think it's pretty attractive, but there are lots of things that people don't like anymore. They think that, it's fairly physically demanding work. Brand new, very recently renovated plants are like the GM's Factory Zero are bright, clean, but plants have a reputation of being dark, dirty, and dangerous. They're not downtown. They take more time to get to, and the hours aren't flexible, right? There's no work from home. So those are all challenges. There's a lot of great work by the Manufacturing Institute, joint with Deloitte, about that. But if you look at messaging, I certainly know from GM, it's about, we want to bring our workers along with us. They've been lifelong learners. They've transitioned from vehicle program to vehicle program. The skills are applicable. We will train. And right in the UAW contract is a lot about requiring training for the current workforce to bring them along. I think that probably would have happened anyway, but it's formalized, and that's something where there's really incentive alignment. And in my opinion, as an economist, the tightest part of our labor force right now is people who are willing to do physically demanding work. We've got a long-term headwind from lower male labor force participation. Oh, there's certainly women in plants. Prime age male labor force participation is about 83%. It's down from about 86 before July 2008. So it's like 25 to 54. That doesn't even get into the retirement. And less educated workers, across ages have lower participation. So I think 48% for no high school diploma, 57% for high school grads with no college. This is not just males or prime age, but that's 63% for people with college education, 72% with bachelors. Like, this is a tight part of the labor market. You want to bring your workers along, and that may be a real incentive to figure out what you can locate in those locations. For locations that get left behind, right? That's the place for place-based policies.
Dustin, I don't know if you have strong views on the electric vehicles as well, or or we can go back to.
I don't have strong views. I would just reinforce a point that Elaine made about the sort of gradual nature of the sort of EV shift, just because we've got a lot of cars out there anyways, market penetration rates, aren't, super high. I think there's countervailing forces, which is a point Robert made about who is it that's actually making the EVs, not, the GMs, the unionized shops of the world are very different than some of the other, Tesla, Hyundai, BYD, et cetera. And so how the broader macroeconomic trade forces play out here will in part determine whether the sort of, I'm not going to say it's the rosier view. I mean, Elaine's, this is very, backed by data that Elaine's thought through. A more optimistic view is going to be in tension with some of those competitive processes. And, I think how the UAW and others can craft these good jobs, perhaps for broader sets of workers, will be an important thing to keep track of.
Just one quick reply. You alluded this, but just for the audience, there are lots of autos that are made in the U.S. that are not made by the union Detroit 3. And the southeast of the U.S. has lots of auto plants from the plants, the European and Asian automakers that are made there. And certainly the UAW is hoping with the rich contract that they reach that they will have more success in unionizing some of those plants than they have in the past.
So thanks. Maybe Robert, we can go back to the question on what's missing in this industrial policy. We are short of time, so if you can, both the three of you, if you can compress your question to 3 minutes, it would be great.
Okay, so
what's missing in the green industrial policies?
Well, I think firstly, I mean, there's the adjustment of those who are dislocated, and in the United States, now it's become popular to talk about place-based policies. But if you look at how much money we devote to depressed areas, certainly from the federal side, it is trivial. I mean, basically $4 billion or something they give. And so what's had to happen in the United States is that these adjustment policies have sort of been wedged into the IRA and the CHIPS Act and so on, because we don't have an overarching program that deals with forgotten places. And in that context, quite naturally, if you've got the IRA, then you say, well, we want the people who are working in the brown energy jobs to go to the green energy jobs. But if you go down to the community level, in some communities, that adjustment may be appropriate, but in many, it's not. And so each individual place, just like every country, one size doesn't fit all. And communities then have to develop a strategy by which they will respond. And it can't be a cookie cutter approach. And we haven't really moved in that direction. So I think it's severely deficient with respect to that approach. If we look at Europe, it's interesting. Oh, and by the way, in the United States, we have a long tradition, and it was replicated in our approach to energy communities. We start off by saying, well, we've got to deal with the worst hit. We've got to really focus like a laser beam on those who are the worst affected. But once this thing has gotten through Congress, what you see is everyone wants a piece of the action. And so it gets spread. And if you look at the geographic territories that qualify for the tax break as being a quote unquote energy community, what you see is, I don't know, it's somewhere around a third of the geographic area of the United States. So you're not targeting like a laser beam, you're actually spreading it out because that's what Congress, members of Congress want. And by the way, this is a replication of our Model Cities program, which we had in I guess it was in the late 60s. And most of our economic development strategies go that way. And so at the end of the day, it's up to the states to come up with their own strategies. Now, in Europe, they're very different. And their approach has been to single out communities and to try to work out programs that make sense and to have contracts between the commission and the individual area in order to target the adjustment strategy. So I think their approach is much more sensible. Nonetheless, it's easier said than done. There are often problems in that in some places you find the kind of human capital and social capital are very strong, and they're able to adjust. And in other places, you don't find anyone to talk to who's going to stand for the community. So these are really tough problems, as I see them. And but we are devoting an inadequate amount of resources in the US, and we're not going about it the right way. And we're so far focused, if we think about this adjustment, simply at the local level on the places that are going to be damaged. However, we need programs that are going to activate political support widely. And that's where, you know, a strategy. Now, you could see, in the US, we've already, the fact that we didn't go to prices, the fact that we didn't tax CO2 emissions was already an indication of the kind of political opposition in the United States to actually taking what we economists think of as the most effective approach. Interestingly, they were able to apply that in Europe. In Europe, where I think they need to take the next step is to take the money they've raised from the taxes and to give it as rebates back to consumers, so that the average person is not made worse off, but the incentive structure remains. In the United States, our approach has left us with a huge tax burden. And that's something we're going to have to confront down the road. We have large budget deficits. We're starting to appreciate that. The easy solution is to say, well, we'll tax the very rich and the corporations, but it's going to be a hard sell. So I think in addition to the sort of intellectually demanding construction of adjustment policies, there's going to be the financially demanding dealing with the imminent fiscal pressures in the US as we move down the road.
Thanks. And one problem I think in Europe, and this, I can speak for my country, Italy at least, when we get the money from the European Union, we don't know how to spend it. So that's another issue. So for instance, we get a lot of money for the South, but most of this money usually goes back to Brussels because we don't use it. And so these are other sort of issues that are more specific to parts of Europe, at least. Dustin, going back to you, how would you address the credibility challenge that you discussed at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I want to just very briefly reinforce some points that Robert made. One is on this kind of public finance side. So this is an area of work that I'm doing a lot of work in right now. There are states in the United States like Wyoming where 50% of the state budget is from taxes on fossil fuel extraction. The New Mexico state education budget is about 90% from taxes on fossil extraction. Okay, so like the public finance implications of these things are massive, and the fossil fuel companies have been really good at that because they know, you know, they'll sponsor the county fair and, you know, all these sorts of things, right? Build the football stadium. So, you know, that's a big sort of cluster of things. There's also there's an institutional capacity shortfall as well. So let's imagine we had the resources Robert wants us to put in place. One of the things we hear regularly from communities is that they don't have the institutional capacity to actually apply for those funds. They're not structured the way. They need more Kennedy School students to be embedded, right? In other words. But there's like there are a number of very challenging things here. It's like, so for example, to qualify for some of the programs in the IRA, with some of the grant programs, you have to front the money and then the government reimburses you. They don't have the money to front in the first place. So you're telling a community that's already poor, you're going to need to front the $200,000 and then we'll reimburse you 6 months from now. They're like, what am I going to do? Take out a loan at 7%, right? So there's a number of like institutional capacity things, some of which can be, I think, addressed through structural policy design things, but others that are just, you know, people are working 3 jobs already and now you want them to apply for a grant for their community. It's really hard. Okay, so there's a severe institutional capacity sort of thing. How to make some of these things more credible? You know, there's a couple. Our book is about that, and some of you will win it today, and others of you should buy it. I don't make money from it; it's an academic book, right? But you know, we talk about a couple different things. You know, one is you know, making some of the benefits more transparent here. So we talk about the state of Minnesota, who their Public Utility Commission passed a law saying any new wind development projects has to report the percentage of jobs going to local workers. Okay, so that's, you know, gives you a flavor of simple, it's not a requirement that you hire locals, you just make, and it change some of the conversation there. Other things are your more basic, like having communities themselves be co-designers of what investments are. That sort of mutual lock-in, like we're in this together, it gets a lot of incentives right. You get the private information that the community has about what will actually work, right? You get funding that they don't have, and you get the incentives right, so you don't have moral hazard and other problems, and you go engage in a co-design process. And that's something like, you know, in my conversations with the Biden administration, they're actually trying to do more of that. It's been a little slow to get the money out, frankly. But there's more and more of those things. Another thing, and this is just one of these dream type things, is that when you pass legislation in bipartisan ways, people think it's going to stick around a lot longer. Lo and behold, IRA was a completely partisan bill, right? And so part of the desire of Biden to make this be a bipartisan thing, which he did get for infrastructure and chips, is that it's a signal of like this stuff is going to stick around a lot longer. And guess what? Chips and infrastructure as funding mechanisms are going to stick around a lot longer than the IRA, right? And that's, you know, that's a prediction. I guess I get to make it. I'm tenured. You know, so you know that's another thing that you can think about to make some of these policies more credible, more long-lasting, and deliver benefits. The final thing I'll say is that being intentional about the design of some of these, you know, sometimes people talk about community benefit agreements, making sure that these states and these localities aren't getting taken for a total ride. What I am seeing in a number of things like battery plants in the Southeast, the terms of these deals and the tax incentives that they are getting for them are horrendous, right? They're cooking the books in terms of the number of jobs, how much they're getting paid, et cetera. And oh, by the way, in many places, if you are found to be in violation of the terms of the agreement to get these tax incentives, you just pay back wages. You don't pay a penalty, right? And so the design of a number of these contracts is just, you know, it's not what we would want to see. But these states are competing against each other, right? And you got a race to the bottom type dynamic. Everyone wants a battery plant. So, you know, helping to sort of these states and localities ensure that there are some of these constraints, similar to what GM and others have done in working with UAW, I think is going to be an important part of the piece here.
I'm more optimistic than Dustin, though, about IRA, and you just explained my reasoning, right? So, one, lots of people who didn't vote for it show up at the opening of those plants that create jobs in their districts. So that will create, it's hard to vote to take down those big plants in your district. And secondly, ACA is still standing despite a number of challenges that have undermined it.
I agree with that. But you go and you look at the actual rhetoric and what people talk about those openings and whatnot, IRA is never mentioned.
Could I ask, as a political scientist, so let's imagine that the Republicans didn't vote for these programs, but actually we've got a Republican governor, and now a nice big plant has opened up and we've created a whole lot of jobs. Who will people vote for?
Yeah,
will they vote for the incumbent because he or she happens to be there at the moment? Or will they vote for the party that actually came up with the money?
They'll vote for the incumbent. And but the key question is, so at some level, I don't care as long as that governor wants more of that industry. And to Elaine's point, if you get I don't care so much if the credit claiming is about IRA. If the credit claiming is about good new jobs, who cares?
Fantastic data source, Charge the Book, Jay Turner's website. They'll give you maps for the supply chain for batteries by the type.
So before panel goes wide. So let me ask you one very quick final question, then we let the audience to jump in. What's the role of corporation in this? How can they make sure that, how can they mitigate concerns about the transition and contribute to create popular support?
So, so specifically for auto corporations. So first of all, I think as a corporation, you've got, the challenge that you're always talking to multiple stakeholders. But I think that you are, right, so you're talking to investors and you're talking to workers and you're talking to communities, and there are all sorts of political audiences as well. You need to make sure that you're speaking with integrity so that your communication is broadly consistent, because everyone's watching all the messaging. But I think that transparency is generally rewarded. So if I were an automaker, I'd be talking about what I'm doing to retain my workforce and bring them along in transition. I wouldn't just be talking about jobs when I announce a new plant, but I'd be talking about this story that the total amount of labor is similar. I think it's worth noting that only Ford has said something different, and I don't know what they've figured out that's different or why they're doing it. Remember, messaging that was said before the UAW negotiation, how are you negotiating? But I would be talking about this, and I'd be talking about your long-term plans, and I'd be talking about those jobs, and that I think even your investors trust you more if you're transparent and have integrity and details behind it.
Thanks. So now it's time for the audience to ask questions. Anyone? Over there. And it's good if you can briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Jacob Greenspan. I'm a researcher here at the Kennedy School. We talked a lot about the job impacts of EVs, and I was curious about the wage impacts, because to some degree, when you talk about the labor supply issues, that's endogenous to the wage, and as well to the degree that there's increases in productivity from EVs versus other cars, like how much would that translate over to wages?
So for the Detroit 3 automakers, you can look at the UAW contract terms, but they've gotten those battery plants, again, not only under the contract, but at much higher wages than was the prevailing wage immediately before. And there's relatively limited battery plants that were already open. There's good research on ripple effects of wages and stuff that says that the more unattractive qualities a job has, it's dangerous, it's, far away, whatever, you have to pay more. Again, manufacturing's still going to have that. But again, I think the whole path of battery wages got pulled up by the UAW contract. Then you have to say what's going to happen for batteries made domestically for non-union auto shops, and what is the UAW's success in unionizing where they've never succeeded before. But even so, you see this ripple effect that many of the automakers, the non-union automakers, prophylactically announced substantial wage increases for this year to try to head off unionization. And again, if they have a battery plant that has lower wages, they have to be even more concerned about UAW efforts or other union efforts there.
Thanks. Anyone else? We have a couple here. Jan?
Hi, maybe this isn't the audience to say this, but my name is Russell DeGraff, and I was the Speaker Pelosi's chief advisor and negotiator during the IRA. And now I'm a fellow here this semester. So, but I just wanted to hear more. I heard a lot of stories from you guys that actually I remember we talking about in the formation of this law, and we didn't have the votes to be able to accomplish. I just wanted to hear more concrete examples of things that Congress should do in the future.
I've got a couple.
Yeah. Particularly the Minnesota thing, a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Minnesota model is great. I mean, it's chapter 6, something of the book, if you need some sleeping assistance. There are a range of things. Just going to the public finance piece, I've got a white paper coming out shortly that's about the fact that if you cite renewables on federal land, the federal government keeps all the revenue from that and doesn't go back to the states, whereas for oil and gas and coal, it does. I mean, that's just like a give me. There's a couple congresspersons that have proposed legislation. Yeah, exactly. I mean, just surface, that just seems an obvious thing to do. I'd say another thing is stop leading so much with tax incentives, because it's leading to this backlash dynamic that Robert's describing, and your average taxpayer is thinking, well, wait a second, that's going to come and hit me at some point. So, there was a lot of like IRA cheerleading that was being done, just, hey, cool it here. The third thing I would say is, and this is kind of like a closet dream of mine, is will the inefficiencies of industrial policy be able to create a coalition around getting a carbon price, right? And like that's an opening that the Democrats should be negotiating with Republicans around. Like, hey, the IRA is something that like kickstarted this process. It's great. We got some good things in place. It's going to have a hard time being durable over the long run. We know it's inefficient because of all what the economists tell you it is. But we had to do it in order to get something going. That's what's exciting about the IRA. But can this be like a mechanism to get us into that next stage where we just say, hey, all right, fine, like we're set up now. We're not going to be able to do this forever. We need to put in a market mechanism. Frankly, we might need to be putting in market mechanisms to be competitive with things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the European Union. So is there a forcing function that we can get to that gets us into that? And whether it's 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I don't know. But we shouldn't take too many political scientists put aside carbon pricing because it wasn't politically feasible. But that could have been the past. We might be on a different path now, and I think there's a lot of excitement. You can always recycle the revenue from a carbon. I mean, that was a lot of my early work was about how do you recycle carbon taxes in order to build political support, right? And so I think there are a lot of opportunities there, but that's going to be cross the aisle type dialogue between Democrats and Republicans.
There's a great new NBER working paper by Jim Stock, who heads the Salata Institute, Catherine Wolfram of MIT, and a couple other authors on policy alternatives for 2025, and sort of remixing, including a carbon fee with or without IRA or different parts of it, and the fiscal and climate impacts.
So, Roberto?
So I actually think I understand that the IRA was made in Congress, and it looks like it. And there's a very unfortunate, it's like they talk about something designed by a committee, and you had to get a lot of stuff for a lot of people. But one direction in which I think you've gone, it went far too far, is basically in its protectionism. And if we're thinking about it, if we're really serious about trying to deal with climate change, we want to have, let's take wind power. A windmill is basically the Eiffel Tower with a propeller on it. And so it's hugely steel intensive and other kinds of metals intensive. We have a 25% tariff on imported steel. We have a 10% tariff on imported aluminum. Now, why do we think we're going to have the most competitive wind? And it leads us to have to subsidize our wind power. So wouldn't we have exempted the steel imports when it came to that? Because that would have reduced the price. If we look at solar panels, we now see the studies tell us that after the subsidies that are going to be provided, it's still going to be far more expensive to produce solar panels in the United States than their current price in China. So what I'm suggesting is that we have the opportunity to take advantages. I don't know, I'm not against some trade protection when we have genuine strategic problems that face us. But we need to distinguish those from the broader Buy America provisions which have been introduced, which, after all, we have a shortage of people in America, not jobs. And yet, we still continue to try to encourage more employment instead of paying attention to getting the stuff at the lowest cost. And when it comes to climate change, we need to prioritize getting the policies implemented in the least cost way possible.
So, probably Joanna?
Thank you, Edo. My name is Ioana Petrescu. I'm a European Climate Pact ambassador and a former politician. And so my question, I think, is probably for Robert, but it can be for all of you. Um, how do we actually fight this populism? Because what you mentioned were very reasonable policies and solutions that would solve the climate problem, that would solve the jobs problem, that would do all of these things. But in my experience, when you go against someone in a debate, and that someone is a populist, these arguments that you presented are not going to go there very far. So my question to you, Robert, is it something we can learn from the mistakes in the trade debates or in the populists that happen for protectionism that we can take not to repeat the same mistakes when we are countering the populism that we see against the green transition? Thanks.
It's a great question, and I don't have the answer. Now, it is very difficult, and I actually think that because of the polarization, because of the sort of cultural identity issues, which have led some people to oppose climate change, where others support it, it's going to be very difficult to convince those people to change their minds. And so instead of trying to change their minds, I actually think we have to change their behavior. And how do we change their behavior? It's by changing the economic incentives which they face. You know, a lot of people may be skeptical about climate change, but if they can fit solar panels onto their roofs and get cheaper electricity, they're going to do that anyway. So it does seem to me that, and this perhaps would also be how I would look at the IRA a little differently. We really need research. We've had some major reductions in the cost of renewable energy. But instead of paying as much as we are to get people to adopt the existing technologies, I would prefer to see a much greater emphasis on research and development to lower the costs. In a sense, that's where I think our dollars should be going. It's not today's technology, it's the cheaper technology. And then we don't have to convince those people. Now, the people who we do have to motivate are, in a sense, the apathetic middle. There are a large number of people who do believe in climate change, but are not doing much about it. And that's where the power of persuasion, I think, needs to be focused. Not the skeptics, but rather the people who are more or less inclined to go along. How can we motivate them to be more active and engaged? And we need to develop narratives which motivate those people.
Thanks. I see that your room is slowly emptying out, so maybe we have time for a couple more questions over there, and then you, John.
Thank you. My name is Martin. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. My question is, don't you think the regressive nature of some of these policies where you can get $15,000 to get an EV explains part of the backlash you were mentioning, how there's very little money for trade remediation programs, but still you get all these subsidies for putting solar panels in your house and so on. Don't you think that's part of the reason we see the backlash?
Thanks. And maybe, John, do you want to ask?
I'll be real brief. And this is a more general question. When you think about the three major acts, for example, in the United States, they all lay out different strategic objectives. And when you have different strategic objectives, my experience is you get institutional chaos and you get disaster. And in particular, I'm thinking about, okay, if I have place-based programs to deal with unemployment and I should be targeting building, you know, my battery plant or take your chips plant in Appalachia. But if I'm concerned about being a technological leader, I may want to put it where academic institutions are and I can build into R&D programs. And if I really want to think about it from Robert's perspective of how are we going to be competitive, I want to kind of put it where I have the least cost labor structure and the least cost production cycles, right? And I don't know how those get rationalized right now. Is it just a mess and I have to accept that? Or do you have suggestions on ways that those different strategic objectives could be rationalized in some way?
So I would suggest to go maybe in reverse order. You can start, and I
Quick
would
reply
say,
to Martin.
yeah,
So, in addition, right, I mean, most of the focus of the EV tax credits, and there are three, goes on the new vehicle tax credit. And most Americans buy used cars. Most cars have 4 owners in their lifetime. Now, making new vehicles cheaper makes them cheaper when they get to the used market too, but that's not that transparent to people. There is also, for what it's worth, there is also used EV tax credit. It's, I believe, $4,000, right? That has to be at least 2 years old and sold through a dealer and so on. But that doesn't get as much sunshine because it doesn't lead to jobs and production in the US.
Dustin, you.
Yeah, this last point is really important. I have a new project, maybe a book, I don't know, that's sort of like talking about all of these policies. There's no free lunch, you know, and we talk about this in terms of goal conflict. And, you know, you can do the place-based stuff, exactly. I mean, again, it's like when you know, there was this old story of like, let's retrain coal workers to be coders. And it was just like, you know, like there's something to it and some can, but like, you know, is that going to be where your marginal efficiency is with the economy as a whole? And so you are seeing this. I would say, just given conversations I've had with people in the Biden administration, you're starting to get more coordination than you did coming out of the gate. I mean, quite frankly, I mean, if it wasn't for folks like him, the IRA almost like, I mean, that was a surprise. Like, it was just like, holy, we got this passed, really? And then like you wake up in the next morning, and it's like, oh crap, we've got to coordinate this with all this other stuff. And that takes time. You know, my biggest concern is where you have particular agencies get locked in on one of these things versus another, right? And then that's creating, that's like institutionalized institutional chaos, right? And so you're getting more and more of these cross-agency working groups where they're actually meaningful rather than just chit-chatty. They're trying, but I'm super concerned with that. I would though go back to a broader point, which Robert led out with. It's like, what's the exact problem we're really trying to solve with some of these things? IRA is trying to solve a Christmas tree's worth of problems, and that creates its own thing, even within the IRA. But there's also the more general point. Are we actually serious about fighting climate change, or is this all just about domestic political economy, right? Solar panels from China. I mean, the one bipartisan thing right now in DC is anti-China. And yet, when I teach my students about the history of like how we have moved the needle on climate, it is because of China. They sort of ripped off some things from the Germans on solar in the meantime, but you know, like the bygones be bygones, right? And do they subsidize their industries in ways that are unfair and anti-competitive? Yes, they do. But this sort of like, we can all get together around anti-China. There's a domestic political logic to that, completely understand, but make no like mistake about it, that will slow our progress. Again, there's a reason to do that, but there's no free lunch.
Thanks. Robert, the final words to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think John's question and brings out the political reality that you know, good economics says what you ought to do is, we know this, Tinbergen won the Nobel Prize. He said, you have at least as many instruments as you have targets. Okay, so if your target is climate change, you need climate policies, and you need to prioritize the climate policies. Good economists always say you want to make the cost transparent. That's another requirement. Let people understand so that they can weigh the costs. But good politics is actually the opposite. Good politics says, if you want a program passed, say it does as many things as possible, because you'll build a coalition that way. And so in order to get everyone on board, you've got to give them a piece of the action. So we get policies which are not designed to focus on one issue, but to try to deal with many simultaneously. And the IRA is a wonderful example. We want union wages, we want left behind communities. So we got a lot of objectives because people have a lot of priorities. And by the way, you should hide the costs. Don't make them transparent. Use quotas where the cost isn't clear, instead of tariffs where they're actually knowing what it's cost them. We tried to hide the costs with a cap and trade program, so that they wouldn't realize that we were really taxing them. But unfortunately, the Republicans called the Democrats bluff on that one. So it's much more difficult that way. So I am 100% with Dustin. We should be moving to a price-based policy, but unfortunately, it's going to transmit to people the fact that we're raising the costs and it's the government that's responsible. So I think there's this inherent conflict between good politics and good economics, and it's unfortunate, but it happens to be a reality of the world in which we live. As an economist, I'll try to do the best I can and persuade people to be as efficient as possible, but I am fully aware that at the end of the day, if you can't bring along this with the politics, you're not going to get what you want.
So thanks. I think it's now time to wrap up. I want to thank Dustin, Elaine, and Robert for this fascinating conversation. We now have time to distribute Dustin's book, and I'm sure that he will be also happy to sign your copies. And so,
all right, I've never done this before.